We are back again with On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMAPlay365. I'm your host Newsome, and we're here again at the Apex in Vegas for UFC Vegas 14. And what a crazy week this has been so far. We lost the headline fight between Islam Makhachev and Rafael dos Anjos after Makhachev had to withdraw. We then had Diego Ferreira put his name in the mix to fight RDA at £155. We had Santiago Ponzinibbio enter the pool to fight RDA at £170. And whilst all this was going on, it was announced that Brendan Allen would fight Sean Strickland in a not so short notice fight this Saturday. And whilst we're getting excited about that fight, we get the news that Paul Felder has stepped up to fight Rafael dos Anjos at £155 on 5 days notice, which will serve as the new main event for this card. I think this card has been dealt a massive upgrade and I'm really looking forward to it. But just before we get into the breakdowns, last Saturday gave me horrible flashbacks to just before the last Fight Island stretch, as I had the Brendan Allen bet cancelled after Ian Heinisch tested positive for COVID-19 about 2 hours before the fights were due to start. That left me with just one official bet on Glover Teixeira at plus 210, which cashed beautifully at the end of the night. Teixeira was also the $4.99 dog of the week too. Remember, we have multiple packages on the MMAPlay365 website for all the UFC betting advice you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too, so to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAPlay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights in the main event of the evening. We've got Paul Felder versus Rafael dos Anjos. Dos Anjos is currently the minus 190 favourite. The comeback on Paul Felder at plus 165 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I think the fight is lined pretty fairly if I'm being honest, so I don't see too much value. I think Dos Anjos is the rightful favourite here for reasons that I'll speak about very shortly. Paul Felder, I think he's not a bad underdog, but, you know, short notice, I just get the betting line. I think it's fair. And as for where this betting line moves closer to fight night, I do think that we'll see some fluctuation for sure. In some spots, Dos Anjos is minus 200, and I do think everywhere else will catch up to that at some point. But again, I talk about the brick wall of the betting line. I think at some point, maybe minus 200, maybe minus 220, it'll hit a brick wall and we'll start to see money coming in on Felder just out of principle for the fact that that would be a relatively sized underdog for somebody that does fight for your money like Paul Felder. So ultimately on fight night, I don't think that the betting line is going to close too far off from where we're at right about now. And as for how the fight plays out, from a striking perspective, they are both really good strikers. They both put in good work on the feet. A little bit different style though. So Paul Felder is more predominantly with his kicks. Of course he uses his hands. Of course he uses his elbows. He's got a really dangerous Muay Thai game. But I think his kicks are where he's definitely strongest. Whereas Rafael dos Anjos, he will mix it up. He'll throw nice low kicks himself, but he also likes to let his hands go as well. He's got power in his hands also. And from a style perspective, in regards to the striking, I think you've got dos Anjos that is the more technical striker, that will look to be more patient, that will look to make his reads, and like I say, everything he throws is crisp, it's clean, it's thrown with intent. Whereas with Paul Felder, I'm not saying he's not a technical striker, because he is. I just don't think he's as technical as Rafael dos Anjos. But I think with Felder, he throws with more heat. I think he's definitely the more dangerous fighter in regards to power. So for example, if we see a finish in this fight, I think with dos Anjos it'll be more accumulation of volume, you know, him putting the work in, him methodically breaking down Paul Felder, maybe hurting his legs, maybe cutting Felder, things that will affect performance. And then ultimately, you know, Felder might go down and then the referee will step in to save the day, opposed to RDA actually going in there and flooring Felder. I'm not saying that can't happen, I'm just saying I don't think it's very likely. Whereas if we see a finish from Paul Felder, I think that will be a finish where Paul Felder lands a hard body kick that puts dos Anjos down instantly, a hard head kick that puts dos Anjos down instantly, an elbow that knocks him out. It'll be something vicious that knocks him out. So that's the difference in the styles of striking with these guys. In regards to the wrestling and grappling, this is definitely where I give dos Anjos the advantage in this fight. I do think he's the better wrestler. I definitely think he's the better grappler. And if he can get on top of Felder, I do believe he'll be able to do good work topside, get that top control time in, dominate, potentially look for a submission. I think Felder might be able to get back up to his feet at times, but it depends how relentless Dos Anjos would be with his wrestling, and we haven't seen that for a long time, so I think it would be wrong to assume that he's going to come in here, out-grapple Paul Felder with a relentless wrestling performance. But just one thing to quickly note here, Dos Anjos has been training for Islam Makhachev, so he must have been training for a wrestling opponent. So I can only imagine the amount of wrestling and grappling that Dos Anjos has done in this camp for this fight. So with him getting Paul Felder, although it's a completely different style of fighter to Islam Makhachev, the work that Dos Anjos has put in with his wrestling and grappling actually might make him very confident in going out there and putting wrestling and grappling into this fight, but from an offensive perspective, because he'll have been doing both offensively and defensively in training when preparing for someone like Makhachev. So if he's very sharp from a wrestling and grappling perspective, is what I'm trying to say, then it wouldn't actually be a bad idea for Dos Anjos to go out there, even though he's got a different opponent, and just use that wrestling, just use where he's been sharpest during camp and win the fight that way. So that's definitely something to take into consideration in this fight. But one of the main things that really worries me about Felder in this fight is the fact that he's taken this fight on 5 days notice, short notice. Felder, it's no secret, is a big lightweight. He cuts a lot of weight to get to 155 pounds now. I know he said he's been able to take this fight because he's been training for a triathlon and he's down at 175, 170 pounds right now, but I still think that even if he makes the weight, which I'm sure he will because he is a true professional, it's more of his sharpness in regards to fighting that's the concern, opposed to him totally being wiped out because of cardio. I don't think 5 rounds is the best move. I know, as I've just mentioned, he said he was training for a triathlon, but I still don't think for somebody like Felder, the short notice fight, over 5 rounds is the best move for him. But in regards to just not having a camp, you need that fight camp to get sharp, to get in shape from an MMA perspective, to be ready for a fight. He was ready for a triathlon. So I definitely think from that perspective, an MMA fight at the highest level against a solid opponent in Dos Anjos over 5 rounds, where it's going to be quite even from a striking perspective, but then I think Dos Anjos has got the advantage from a wrestling and grappling perspective and likely had a wrestling and grappling focused fight camp. For all those reasons, I'm picking Rafael Dos Anjos to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a crazy one here. We've got Abdul, Razak, Alhassan versus Khaos Williams. Alhassan is currently the minus 230 favourite. The comeback on Williams at plus 190 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, again, I think it's lined relatively fairly, and considering how I think this fight is going to go down, there is probably value on Khaos Williams, but it's a really tough stretch to see him getting the job done against Alhassan. As for where the betting line moves, I do think we're going to see some fluctuation here. I do think that Alhassan's line is going to come down a little bit. I do think people will bet on Khaos Williams just because of his style and how this fight again is likely going to play out, but I think it'll only get so low and hit that brick wall, and ultimately I just don't think that the lines are going to close too far off from where they're at right about now. But as for how this fight plays out, I think that Williams' first name describes how this fight is going to go down. I think it's going to be absolutely chaos. I think both fighters are going to step inside the cage, they're going to come forward, they're going to be aggressive, they're going to want to take the head off his opponent's shoulders. I honestly think this fight is going to be nuts. I don't see it being boring at all, which, famous last words, Francis Ngannou versus Derek Lewis right there, but I just don't see it here. I think both guys are way too forward fighting on the front foot, got way too much power to be sitting back and trying to fight a technical fight, especially with Alhassan. His last fight was very disappointing. I think that on a different night, he'd have been able to take Munir Aziz out, but Munir Aziz, credit to him, debut on the night, great win for him, great performance. But yeah, Alhassan was a little bit underwhelming, a little bit disappointing. So I think in this fight, he'll be looking to get that back for sure. He doesn't want to have 2 disappointing fights on the bounce or 2 losses on the bounce either. So I think for as much aggression and power as both fighters have, when you do look at the technique and when you do look at the cardio of both fighters, I think Alhassan just checks those boxes a little bit more than Khaos Williams. A great debut for Khaos Williams, by the way, against Alex Morono, absolutely flooring him as a relatively sized underdog as well. That just shows you the aggression and power that he has. But you have seen in tape with Khaos Williams, when the fights do get stretched, he does get a little bit tired. tired. The power seems to deplete just a little bit as well. So if this fight goes late into round 2, late into round 3, I think Alhassan will be carrying his cardio and his power a little bit more than what Khaos Williams will. I think that definitely gives him an advantage, and from a technical perspective, I think Alhassan is the more technical striker. Even though he's got a ton of power and he's aggressive, I think he picks his shots a little bit better, and he's got more experience at the higher level as well. So for all those reasons, I do think it's going to be a mad fight. It's not going to surprise me if they get into a brawl and Khaos Williams lands something that knocks Alhassan out cold, but I am picking Abdul, Razak, Alhassan to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fight that's been booked a couple of times and never materialised, so hopefully it does go down on Saturday night. We've got Julian Marquez versus Saparbeg Safarov. Marquez is currently the minus 280 favourite. The comeback on Safarov at plus 240 as the underdog. Now, as for where the value is on this betting line, I do tend to feel that the value sits with the favourite in Julian Marquez at minus 280. I think this is a good fight for Marquez to come back to, a fight where he's going to have a lot of advantages, and a fight where I just feel is the better fighter, and I just don't see him dropping the ball on this one. As for where the betting line moves, I do think again we're going to see some fluctuation. We have seen Marquez at minus 300. Some money has come back in on Safarov, so it seems like that minus 300 is the brick wall there. We might even see some more money coming back in on Marquez. I do think that we'll see money coming in on Safarov to the point where it might drop Marquez down to minus 250, minus 260. And I think that's ultimately where the line's going to close. But I think if it gets lower than minus 250, I think people will just be slamming Marquez in all the parlays, maybe playing him straight as well. And it'll just lift that line up a little bit. So around Marquez, minus 260, minus 265 is where I think the line is going to close for him. As for how this fight plays out though, I think that Safarov definitely has a path to victory in this fight. Marquez has been taken down in previous fights, and that's obviously where Safarov does do his best work. He's a little bit crazy on the feet, leaves him a little bit open, and that's where I see Marquez taking advantages of Safarov and the holes in his game. But on the mat, in the wrestling, is where Safarov really needs to push it in this fight. He's got to shoot on Julian Marquez, and Marquez isn't the easiest fighter to take down. You do have to work to take him down, and I think that's where Safarov is going to have issues, because Safarov also doesn't have the best cardio. He can go 3 rounds, but it tends to be 3 rounds of him being in control of the fight, and that's important. When he's not in control of the fight, he does tend to tire a little bit more. I do think that Safarov could take Marquez down once or twice in that first round, but like I say, Marquez is going to make Safarov work for every single takedown, and even if Safarov does do well in round 1, he maybe even takes round 1, I just don't see that cardio carrying through the second and third round. And although Marquez doesn't have the best cardio either, I definitely think he's got better cardio than Safarov. It'll be one of those fights, in my opinion, if it goes late, where both fighters are tired, but it's Safarov that's looking completely gassed just because he's the more tired fighter. On the feet, in the striking department, is where Marquez is going to have a lot of success here. I think Safarov is definitely hittable. He doesn't move his head too much. He comes forward in straight lines. Marquez has got good striking, good combinations, power in both hands, mixes in kicks as well. So on the moments where Safarov's not shooting for a takedown, I think Marquez is just going to be absolutely pinging Safarov with shots. I think he's going to be lighting him up. I think he's going to be tagging him. I think he's going to be making him tired. Every time he hits him, I think that'll deplete the cardio a little bit more. I think he'll bust Safarov up, and I think at some point it's just going to get really tough for Safarov, whether he takes a 3-round beating, because he is very tough and he is hard to put out. He'll either take a 3-round beating, or I think Marquez will put him out in the middle of the fight. So I'm picking Julian Marquez to win this fight. And in the next fight in the heavyweight division, we've got a fun one here. We've got Don'Tale Mayes versus Roque Martinez. Mayes is currently the minus 225 favourite. The comeback on Martinez at plus 185 is the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, considering this fight, who both fighters are, how they both fight, where the fight's going to take place, the value has to be on Roque Martinez as the underdog at plus 185. I do understand why Mayes is the favourite, but at minus 225, I just think it's really, really wide. As for where the betting line moves, some money has been coming in on Mayes at minus 225, minus 220 as well. Again, I think it's going to hit a brick wall at some point where it just gets too ridiculous, that out of principle and the fact that these guys are big heavyweights that are going to slug it out on the feet, I do think that money will come back in on Roque Martinez at some point very soon. I do think that Mays is going to close at around -200. I think that money on Martinez will push it a little bit, but not too far, and I think that's ultimately where the betting line is going to close. But as for how this fight plays out, I think that Martinez is getting a little bit disrespected on the betting line just because of how his last fight went on his UFC debut. But listen, that fight was taken on just a couple of days' notice for him. As I mentioned, UFC debut, and he fought Alexander Romanov, that not only is a surging prospect in the heavyweight division, but a great fighter himself, and in an awful stylistic matchup for Martinez as well, with Romanov being a wrestler and Martinez not being a wrestler and not being able to defend takedowns that well and just preferring to stand on the feet and slug it out. So I think that recency bias definitely plays into the betting line here. I think that this fight is going to take place on the feet. I'd be surprised if any fighter shot for a takedown. If we do see a takedown, it is more likely to come from Mays, but Mays is a striker himself, so I think both guys are going to go in there. I think they are going to try and land heat on each other. Martinez is tough. You know, even if Mays starts putting it on him, starts tagging him up, I think Martinez can stay in the fight. I think that he's going to have better preparation in this fight than he did his last fight as well. And ultimately, I think it's who's going to land the more volume versus who's going to land that power shot. And I think one of those two is going to be the winner of this fight. I think the more volume is likely to come from Mays just because Martinez is a little bit bigger, his movement's not as great. So I think from a volume perspective, I do expect Mays to land more shots throughout the fight for as long as this fight goes on. But from a power perspective and putting the opponent out, I do give that to Martinez. I think Martinez is going to pack more of a punch in this fight, and I think if he does land on Mays, he could knock him out. So as I said, I think it's going to be volume versus power, but with this being a heavyweight fight, and with this fight very likely to be predominantly taking place on the feet, I do think that one of these guys is going to land that knockout blow. I think the more likely fighter to land that knockout blow is Roque Martinez, so I'm picking Roque Martinez to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is the fight that nobody expected and nobody predicted to happen this weekend. We've got Brendan Allen versus Sean Strickland, and in regards to the odds, it's lined as a coin flip. You've got to pick them with -110 on either side. As for where the value is on that betting line, again, as I say very often, I think if you've got a good read on this fight, then either side's playable as long as you have that good read. And as for where the betting line moves, Brendan Allen did open up a bigger underdog. We did see him at +130, at +120. At one point, 5 Dimes and Sportbet had Brendan Allen as a -170 favourite, whilst Bet Online had Brendan Allen as a +120 underdog. So I'm not sure what the confusion was there, but the bottom line is I think money's coming on both guys. I think it settled it as a -110 pick'em, and ultimately I do see some money coming in on Allen very closer to Fight Night. I don't think he's going to go off as a -125 or a -130 favourite, but I could definitely see him just sneaking into the slight favourite spot at -115 with Strickland at -105, for example. Ultimately, I don't think the line is going to be too far off where we're at right about now come Saturday night on Fight Night. And as for how this fight plays out, similar to what I said with Allen and Heinisch last week on the podcast, you know, I think that it is a striker versus grappler fight, but both striker and grappler have very complete mixed martial arts styles. They can both strike, they can both grapple, they can both wrestle. Both fighters here are genuinely good everywhere. It's just, I think Strickland is going to want to keep this fight on the feet, and I think Allen is going to want to take this fight down to the mat, and that's where the striker versus grappler comes from. And it's who's going to be able to implement the game plan here. Sean Strickland came back from a horrific accident, motorcycle accident. He looked good against Jack Marshman, but no disrespect to Jack Marshman, but Brendan Allen is just completely levels above him in pretty much every facet of MMA. So although Strickland looked good there, this is a completely different fight from a skill perspective and a style perspective too. But regardless, I think Strickland needed a fight like that just to ease himself in after the layoff and after the accident, and I think this is a good fight for him to take so soon after looking good against Jack Marshman in that spot. So for Strickland, like I say, he's got to keep the fight on the feet, he's got to keep moving. He isn't going to be able to push forward as much in this fight because Brendan Allen is definitely the fighter that fights more on the front foot, definitely the fighter that is more aggressive, that will come and crash forwards. He won't be on the back foot. He won't be happy with that. And if Strickland does start to be aggressive, I think Brendan Allen will just meet him in the middle. And if they tie up, then that's great for Allen because he can start working his takedowns. So Strickland, I think, is going to be on the back foot way more than what he was against Jack Marshman. He's going to have to get that jab popping out from a counter-striking perspective, start trying to land that straight right from the jab from a counter-striking perspective and try and catch Brendan Allen as he's crashing forwards, because that's ultimately what Brendan Allen's going to do. Brendan Allen will come forward aggressively, he will come forward recklessly, and I do believe that Sean Strickland will have some openings. He will have some moments where he cracks Brendan Allen clean coming in. It's just I think Brendan Allen's quite tough, so I'd be surprised if Strickland hit him so hard that he knocked him out. I think Brendan Allen coming forward, he's going to be able to tie up with Strickland at some point. And the two fights from Sean Strickland that really stand out to me are the Alex Garcia and the Kamaru Usman fights. Now, it's a little bit unfair to slam Strickland for the Usman loss, but with Alex Garcia was able to take him down 3 times, and on a couple of those occasions, he got Strickland on his back, settled on his back, and he was able to keep Strickland there. Now, Alex Garcia didn't really try and improve position or land too many strikes, but the fact that there was very little urgency from Strickland to get back up to his feet, and he's not the type of fighter to start throwing up arm bars or triangles off his back either, so if he's not getting back up to his feet, he's either just laying there or landing strikes and laying there, and neither's going to be winning you a fight. But the thing is with Brendan Allen, he is a different type of fighter to Usman and Garcia because he's very active on top in his grappling. Once he gets fights to the mat, which, by the way, is wrestling, he doesn't tend to lean too much on the traditional style takedowns like the double legs and single legs. He's more body locks, trips, hopper back, that sort of fighter trying to get the fight down that way. But once he's on the mat, he's constantly looking to improve his position, to look for a better position to either strike, ground and pound, or to look for a submission, or just to find the back and just control the fight and the round from that position as well. Brendan Allen is very tricky to deal with on the mat, and the way I see this fight going is I think Strickland will have success on the feet for sure, although I do expect improvements from Allen because he's been with Henry Hooft and Sanford MMA this camp, or at least for the Heinisch camp, shall we say. I do expect to see some improvements there, but regardless, I think Strickland is going to be the better striker. If this fight is 15 minutes on the feet, then I think Strickland wins pretty comfortably, but Brendan Allen doesn't fight that way. I do think that we're going to see this fight hit the mat because every Brendan Allen fight hits the mat, and I think at that point, that's when Brendan Allen will be able to deal with Strickland when he's down on the mat in his own world, and I think it could potentially overwhelm Sean Strickland as well, because not only has he never fought anybody with that grappling style of Brendan Allen, this is at middleweight, so Brendan Allen is going to be much bigger and stronger than the previous guys that he's fought in the UFC. So although it's going to be very sketchy if Strickland is defending a lot of takedowns and Allen can't get the fight to the mat, I just see the fight ending up on the mat over the 15-minute period. I think when the fights hit the mat, Brendan Allen is going to be the more superior grappler. I feel that's where the fight's won and lost. I'm picking Brendan Allen to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Antonio Arroyo versus Eryk Anders. Eryk Anders is currently the -140 favourite. The comeback on Arroyo at +120 as the underdog. Now, as for where the value is on this betting line, I don't see too much value if I'm being honest. I think the fight is lined quite fairly. And as for where the betting line moves, I do think this -140 line for Eryk Anders is probably, like I've already mentioned a few times in this podcast, the brick wall. I don't think that the line is going to get much wider than that. I think at this point there might be some money coming in on Arroyo, but again, that betting line's only going to get so low before people start seeing the value in Eryk Anders in this fight. So ultimately, I do feel that come fight night on Saturday night, the betting lines won't be much further from where they are right about now. But as for how this fight plays out, the one real concern I've got for Eryk Anders is the fact that he's taken this fight on short notice. And then when you consider the kicks that Arroyo's going to be throwing at Anders, if he starts kicking to the body, that could deplete his cardio a little bit. If this fight goes late into the second round, into the third round, what does the cardio of Eryk Anders look like at that point? Obviously, the short notice camp and hard kicks hitting you to the body, taking that wind out of you, you know, it could be a little bit of a problem. But from a skill set perspective, I definitely think that Eryk Anders is the better all-round fighter. He's got good hands, good boxing, good combinations, he's got power as well. And the one thing that you need to be a kicker with, a kickboxer like Arroyo, is good hands, good boxing, getting into that boxing range, landing inside the pocket, landing combinations. That's Eryk Anders' style of fight, and I think if he can get past those kicks, he should be able to lie Arroyo up inside the pocket. And listen, I mentioned Anders' cardio. Let's talk about Arroyo's cardio, because this guy throws so much heat, and even in his UFC debut, he was completely and utterly gassed by that third round as well. So, I don't think Arroyo can strike hard, aggressively, throwing those kicks constantly throughout an entire 15 minutes. I think he's going to have to take time off in this fight if he wants to last a full 3 rounds, should it go that long. If he doesn't take that time off and it does go that long, then Eryk Anders is going to take over this fight late, in my opinion. I just think he's got the better all-round style. And talking of an all-round style, if this fight does get tough for Anders, I don't think anybody should be surprised if Anders starts looking to his wrestling and trying to take this fight to the mat, because if he gets Arroyo on his back, then Anders is definitely going to have advantages there as well. And then you've got to think of the experience that Eryk Anders has had at this point in the UFC. He's a more experienced fighter. I do think that fight IQ will come along with that as well. So I just feel that if Anders is put in some tough spots in this fight, he's going to be able to figure a way out with different paths to victory. And ultimately, that's the key factor in this fight, because Anders' boxing inside the range is definitely better than Arroyo's. And I do think that his wrestling and grappling is better than Arroyo's as well. So for me, the only way Arroyo wins is by landing brutal, hard kicks on Anders to his legs, body and head, which is a possibility, but I have to favour the guy with multiple paths to victory, the guy that's more experienced, and the guy that's likely to make the correct adjustments throughout the fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Eryk Anders to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fight between two prospects in the women's strawweight division. We've got Hansen versus Cory McKenna. Hansen is currently the -220 favourite. The comeback on McKenna at +180 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think that the value sits with Cory McKenna at +180 as the underdog. I feel that this fight could be relatively close, and I do give Cory McKenna a decent chance of winning as well. So at +180, I think that's where the value is. As for where the betting line moves, I do think that the line is going to close up. I just think that the -220, the +180, I think the line is too wide. So I am anticipating the lines closing up, and I honestly think that come fight night on Saturday night, we could be seeing Hansen at -140 with Cory McKenna at +125, or roughly around that sort of range. But as for how the fight plays out, it's a really good fight. Like I said, two prospects, women's strawweight division. I do think that both fighters are going to have really good careers. They're both 21 years old, so they've got plenty of time to develop, and they're already looking good and looking like they're developing really fast as well. So it's going to be exciting to see what the future holds for both fighters. Now, you've got Hansen, a purple belt at 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu, so she's got some good grappling. If she can get this fight to the mat, if she can get topside, that's key here. Topside, she has to be the one on top, because Cory McKenna is also got a good top game as well, and ultimately I think that's where this fight is going to be won and lost. I think it's going to be won and lost on the mat. I think it is going to hit the mat at some point, and it's which fighter can spend the longest periods of time in that top position. Cory McKenna, what I like about her is, before the Dana White Contender Series fight, she went out to California with Uriah Faber at Team Alpha Male. She trained there. She got the contract to go into the UFC. She's got this fight, and she stayed out in California as well at Alpha Male. So that means good rounds with the likes of Yan Xiaonan, Sarah McCann. Sarah McCann one's very interesting as well, because if she can really bring on and develop that wrestling to the next level for Cory McKenna, especially in this fight as well, then we could see Cory McKenna going in there, taking Hansen down. She will have to be a little bit careful. I think Hansen's going to be more dangerous on bottom than what McKenna is, but ultimately we saw McKenna in a last fight deal with a very tricky grappler, a grappler that was throwing up rubber guard, was looking to submit McKenna, and she dealt with everything as she should. Her defensive fundamentals were there. She didn't make mistakes. She did the right thing. She was patient, and I quite like to see that from McKenna. So like I say, from the Team Alpha Male perspective, and especially Sarah McCann, that type of fighter could really help her in this fight. But make no mistake about it, McKenna's got to be careful in this fight, because if she gets taken down herself, as I've already mentioned, I don't think she's going to be as effective on her back as what Hansen would be on her back. In regards to the striking, we seem to have two different styles here. Cory McKenna is a former powerlifter, so she's built well, she's got strength, she's got power, and she will look to land hard shots, but I feel that Hansen is more fluid on the feet. I think combinations are a little bit cleaner. cleaner. She moves just a little bit better. And I do think that McKenna is a little more hittable. But listen, McKenna comes forward like she's willing to take a punch, to land 2 or 3 solid, hard punches herself, which, if you're not going to get knocked out, it's actually not a bad tactic to use inside a fight. I just like the way McKenna fights. Sure, the striking, again, like I've said, isn't as fluid as Hansen's, but I do think that she can land on Hansen. I do think she can hit her hard, and I do think that we're going to see takedowns from Cory McKenna, and I do think she'll be able to get Hansen down to the mat. I think both women will spend time on top. I think both women will spend time on the bottom. I just feel that McKenna's going to have the more control time on top than what Hansen is. I think Hansen is a little more dangerous on the mat, but McKenna is more controlled, especially topside. So for all things considered, I think it could be a relatively close fight. I don't think that the betting lines are anywhere close to where they should be. So I'm going to side with the underdog in this fight. I'm picking Cory McKenna to win this fight. And in the next fight, staying in the women's strawweight division, we've got Ashley Yoder versus Miranda Granger. Miranda Granger's currently the minus 140 favourite. The comeback on Yoder at plus 120 is the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do, again, think the value sits with the underdog in Ashley Yoder at plus 120. I think the line should be flipped, if I'm being honest. So to see Miranda Granger at minus 140 quite surprises me. I do think Yoder should be around that sort of range herself. So I do think the value is on Ashley Yoder. Now, as for where the betting line moves closer to Fight Night on Saturday night, it's a little bit of a tricky one because, like I said, I'm surprised where the lines are sitting at now, especially when you consider that Yoder opened up with 5 dimes as a minus 125 favourite and now she's plus 120. Because of that, I do tend to think that the money is going to come in on Yoder, but as the days go by, it just seems like all the money's coming in on Granger. So listen, maybe Granger closes at minus 150, maybe even higher, but personally I do tend to think that the money is going to come on Yoder at some point, but I don't think it's going to be enough money to pull this fight into a pick'em or anything. I do think that we're going to see Miranda Granger at minus 120, minus 125 when they step in the cage on Saturday night. As for how this fight plays out though, it's a really interesting fight for me, and like I say, I am surprised on the betting line because I do think the striking is very close, and I probably would give a very slight edge to Granger in the striking purely just because of her hands. I do think her hands are better than Yoder's, but Yoder's a southpaw and she does fire a lot of kicks, especially to the body. So for the advantages that Granger has with her hands, I do think that Yoder's better with the kicks. It's just, again, I'd probably just give that slight edge onto Miranda's hands over Yoder's kicks. The thing is though, I think it's Yoder with the advantages in the wrestling and grappling departments for sure. We've seen in previous fights that she is so tricky, whether she's on top or bottom. In the Siori Kondo fight, she was very dominant in top control. I'm surprised she didn't get a submission finish there. And then in the Amanda Cooper fight, when Amanda Cooper took her down, she was just very competent off her back. She was throwing up submissions. She never stays still. She never accepts the positions or lays flat on her back and doesn't do anything. She's just very active on the mat on bottom as well. So I think that even if Granger takes her down, I'm just not confident that Granger's going to get the better of Yoder, even if she's on top. So for me, when it comes to takedowns, I think Yoder's got better takedowns. When it comes to grappling, top side or on bottom, I think Ashley Yoder's better there. And I just want to clear something up with Yoder's record as well, because a lot of people give her a lot of stick. Some people call her a .500 fighter, which at 7-6, it's very close and you can't really argue with that, but it doesn't paint a true picture when you look at the record and who she's fought and how those fights have gone down. So let's look at her losses. Her last fight against Livia Renato Souza, it was a close fight, it could have gone her way. Randa Marcos, a close fight, a split decision, it could have easily gone her way. Mackenzie Dern, arguably on her way to winning a decision until that final takedown in round 3. Angela Hill, a very close fight. Justin Quiche, a fight that a lot of people thought that Ashley Yoder won. So overall, you look at the names I've just mentioned on her losses. Lavinia Souza, Randa Marcos, Mackenzie Dern, Angela Hill, Justin Quiche. These are solid fighters that she's taking losses to, and not only taking losses, but going to very close decisions with them, and decisions that could easily have been flipped the other way round. And even if she took half of them, that's half of those losses back against good fighters. I think Granger gets beat by every single one of those fighters as well. So for Ashley Yoder's record being 7-6, I think it is very deceiving. You have to take the level of competition into consideration there. But back to the fight, I think the striking's going to be quite close. I do think that the wrestling and grappling is going to play some factor in this fight. I'm not sure whether it'll be the deciding factor, but I do think that we're going to see the fight hit the mat. I do think when it does hit the mat, we're going to see Yoder just performing better down there. And if this fight goes to a decision and the striking's quite close, the judges will be looking towards the grappling as well, which should be in the favour of Yoder. For all those reasons I've just mentioned, for the stylistic advantages that I give Ashley Yoder in regards to the wrestling and grappling, that's who I'm picking to win this fight. I'm picking Ashley Yoder to win the fight. And in the next fight, we've got Alex Morono versus the returning Rhys McKee. Alex Morono is currently the -190 favourite with the comeback on McKee at +165 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I honestly don't think there's too much value here. I think the line is quite fair, and I do understand why Morono is at -190 and even higher in some spots as well, but in the same respect I don't see too much betting value on that line either, because Rhys McKee can be a game fighter and he could be a fighter that does pull this out the bag. So like I say, the line's fair. I don't see too much value. As for where the betting line moves, I do think we're only going to see money coming in on Alex Morono in this spot. But with that said, again, there's going to be a brick wall at some point, because if Morono gets up to -250, -260, then you're just going to see Rhys McKee bets at that point. But ultimately, come fight night on Saturday night, I think we're going to see Morono stepping into the cage -200, -220 in that sort of range. But as for how this fight plays out, I really wanted to like Rhys McKee here. I really did. The one thing I will say is, at welterweight, I think he's a much better fighter. I think he fills out a little bit more, and you can see that he's not killing himself to make £155. So I do like the move up to welterweight for sure. And the one thing that I'm not going to do in this breakdown is mention the Khamzat Chimaev fight analytically. There's no need to break that fight down. There's no need to really talk about it. We know who Khamzat is. We know it was a good matchup for him. Rhys McKee's debut, you can't slam Rhys McKee for that fight at all. But there are a few fights that I do want to talk about Rhys McKee. Fights that really concern me with him moving forward, and especially in this spot as well. So you look at the Terry Brazier fight quite a while back, but he was getting out wrestled by Terry Brazier. He couldn't stop that relentless pressure. He was getting taken down, and ultimately that's what led him to lose the fight. Now, at the time I thought Terry Brazier was a great fighter, probably UFC bound, but it hasn't materialised that way for Brazier, and actually he's took quite a few losses since then as well, which again isn't a good look. Now we're looking at Rhys McKee. And then the other two fights, Perry Goodwin, Hakan Foss, these are two fights that concern me from Rhys McKee's striking perspective, especially the Perry Goodwin fight. Goodwin was winning that fight. He won the first round, he was doing well in the second round, and he was tagging McKee up badly. McKee was coming forward in straight lines, not moving his head off the centre line, and just getting clipped. And it was really surprising seeing that against Perry Goodwin, because no disrespect to Perry Goodwin, but Rhys McKee technically should have been the better striker in that fight, yet not only did he make the fight close, he was getting beaten in that fight until he eventually came back. There was a brawl and he ended up winning. And also Hakan Foss as well. The fight didn't go on for too long, but for what we did see in those short moments, again, Foss was catching McKee coming in. There was no real striking defense from McKee, no real head movement, and it's a real problem when you're getting tagged up. Now, McKee ended up dropping Foss with a jab. Foss buckled his leg, couldn't get back up, and the fight was over. But again, just concerning when you consider that Rhys McKee is taking a step up in competition to a whole new level in the UFC against someone like Alex Morono, who is good everywhere. He can strike, he's got a nice educated jab, he's got good combinations, he is tough, he will continuously walk forward and chase you down, he'll land volume on you, and that's key in this fight, because for someone like Rhys McKee, I do feel that Morono can just land a ton of volume on him. And unless McKee stops Morono, which honestly I wouldn't be shocked to see that happen, I do think that McKee's path to victory in this fight is to land something hard on Morono and put him away, and I do think it's possible. But if that finish doesn't come, and remember, finishes are much harder to come by in that initial step up to the UFC than what it was in your regional scene in whatever country you came from. I think that if that finish doesn't come from McKee, that Morono's just going to pack a lot of volume. And listen, if Morono wants to shoot a takedown and take McKee down, then I think that's a possibility as well. I'm not sure how likely that is to happen, because Morono doesn't shoot takedowns, but if he does decide to, I do think they're there for him. And then when you look at Morono's grappling, he's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he's a good grappler. I do think he'll be able to spend time on top of McKee. McKee might be able to get back up to his feet. That's one thing he did show in the Brazier fight, the ability to get back up. But overall, I think the striking offensive both guys is quite even, but the thing is, Rhys McKee's a lot more hittable. So from an overall striking perspective, I think Alex Morono's the better striker. I think he's going to land the more volume, and I think he's got multiple paths to victory here to beat somebody like McKee. So I think it's a tough fight for Rhys McKee. The one thing to mention is he is young, he's 24, so he is absolutely going to be developing over time. I do think that he could be a good fighter. You can see that he's got the abilities and he's got the room for development, but I don't think the developments come so fast enough for him to beat Morono in this spot. So I'm picking Alex Morono to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Luis Smolka versus Jose Alberto Quinones. Luis Smolka is currently the -135 favourite. The comeback on Quinones at +115 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Quinones. I think the line should be a little bit closer, maybe even a pick'em. So with plus money on Quinones, I'd be saying the same thing if it was plus money on Smolka. I do feel that the value is with Quinones at that betting line. As for where the lines move, I actually think that Quinones grows as the underdog here. I think that he might go into the fight on Saturday night +120, +125, maybe even +130. I've got a funny feeling that Luis Smolka is just going to be a popular play at -135, especially when you consider the recent fights of Quinones and also considering the developments that Smolka looks to be making in his striking. I do think that he's going to be a popular play, so I think the money's going to come in on Smolka throughout fight week, and he's going to go in a slightly bigger favourite come fight night on Saturday night. But as for how this fight plays out, like I say, Smolka is developing his striking. We know his grappling's always been decent. It's more top side than bottom side though. When he is on bottom, he can get a little bit stuck once the scrambles are finished. He's a good scrambler, but if you can get Smolka settled flat on his back, then I don't think Smolka's as effective on his back than he is on top for sure. But in that Casey Kenny fight, you did see Smolka really work into the body quite a lot. He hit Casey Kenny with a lot of body shots in such a short space of time, so you can see that striking evolving of Smolka's. But Quinones is a very tricky fighter to deal with. He's not an easy fighter to control. He's not an easy fighter to start pulling away from either. He's a fighter that on the feet, he's constantly moving, he's constantly on his toes. He'll throw volume moving forwards, but if you start to really become aggressive against Quinones, he'll just get on his back foot, and he's got good movement, good lateral movement, and he just makes himself very difficult to hit. Even in the Nathaniel Wood fight, sure, Wood landed a few hard shots on him, but Wood is an elite fighter. Wood is a very good fighter, and in that first round, Wood definitely struggled against Quinones. Quinones presented problems to Wood that I don't even think Wood anticipated. So he's a difficult fighter, and I think if Smolka becomes aggressive with his striking, starts coming forward, trying to land these body shots, trying to just connect on Quinones, I think Quinones will just get on his bike and he'll just make himself unavailable to be hit. And then when Smolka's starting to stop putting the foot on that pedal and taking a little bit of a step back, that's when Quinones will come forward. When Quinones comes forward, that's when he'll start landing punches himself, and it wouldn't shock me to see Quinones actually take Smolka down. Again, the scrambles will be a little bit tricky for Quinones to get through. I think Smolka's the better scrambler, but I do think Quinones can put Smolka on his back, and once Smolka's on his back, I don't think he's going to be able to get up very easily against Quinones. Quinones is an underappreciated fighter, I think, and he's a fighter that's got good striking, good wrestling, good grappling. He's good everywhere. He's also difficult to take down, so if Smolka does want to try and get this fight into where he's most comfortable, again, we saw Nathaniel Wood try and take Quinones down, who Nathaniel Wood is a good wrestler as well, and it was difficult for him. I think that although Smolka's making good developments in his game for sure, and he could come in here and look a completely different version of himself, a much better version, and put on a clinic, I think Quinones is just tricky to beat. He's tricky to really touch up unless you're at that elite level, and I don't think Smolka's at that level yet. I think Quinones is going to be on his bike on the feet. I think he's going to be more active. I think he's going to end up landing more volume on the feet, and if this fight hits the mat, I do think it'll be Quinones that's taken Smolka down. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jose Alberto Quinones to win this fight. And in the next fight, back in the women's strawweight division, it seems like we've got a lot of fights in this division on Saturday night. We've got Randa Marcos versus the newcomer Kanako Murata, and it's the newcomer Kanako Murata that's currently the -175 365 favourite. The comeback on Randa Marcos at plus 155 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, again I think it sits with the underdog in Randa Marcos. And it's interesting because Marcos actually stepped in for Livinha Souza. Murata was a favourite against her as well, so the bookmakers clearly love this Kanako Murata that's come from Invicta. I think the value sits with Marcos though. I think that the style of both fighters plays into the hands of Marcos, and I think it's a prime upset spot here for the newcomer and the debutant in Murata. As for where the betting line moves, I'd be shocked if more money kept on coming in on Murata. Over the last 24 to 48 hours, it has been all Murata money, but at some point I think people are going to start betting Marcos and betting that line back down. And although I do think that Murata is going to come into the fight as the favourite, I do think the lines are going to close up. I think Murata might go in there minus 145, minus 140. But as for how this fight plays out, I've already mentioned already that I think the styles of both fighters definitely plays into the hands of Marcos, and what I mean by that is Murata is the boxer wrestler type of fighter, so she'll use her hands, she'll throw heavy heat on the feet, but then she will be looking to level change, and she has got a quick reactive takedown. I will give her that. She does have decent wrestling, but the longer the fights go on, the less successful she becomes with the takedown attempts, but the takedown attempts are still always there. And that's where I think Marcos is going to have a lot of success, because when the takedowns are a little bit more laboured, I think Marcos will not only be able to stuff them, but I think she'll be able to reverse the positions and get on top of Murata. And we've not really seen Murata on her back too much, and as a real offensive wrestler, you do feel that Murata probably won't have the same success on her back than what she has on top. So for me, Marcos has got decent wrestling as well. They're actually both very similar in regards to styles. It's just Marcos doesn't have that traditional wrestling with the takedown attempts as what Murata has. And I think Marcos' striking is improving fight by fight as well. So when you look at the striking, I'd give the edge to Marcos. When you look at the wrestling, I'd give the edge to Murata. But like I say, those takedowns do become a little bit more laboured. This is a big step up in competition for Murata as well, fighting Marcos in the UFC on a debut. And that's why I'm surprised the betting lines are so wide, because it really wouldn't shock me for Randa Marcos to come in here. She might drop the first round, look good striking, but then just get taken down. But in the second and third round, I think that's where Marcos will be able to push through that initial wrestling onslaught. And I think at that point in the scrambles, she'll be able to start winning the scrambles, getting on top herself. And I just think she'll have a better end to this fight than what she will the start. I do think it could be a close fight, but with the style of Murata playing into the style of Marcos, in my opinion, for those reasons, I'm taking the underdog. I'm picking Randa Marcos to win this fight. And in the final fight of the breakdown, we've got Tony Gravely versus Geraldo de Freitas. Tony Gravely is currently the minus 150 favourite. The comeback on de Freitas at plus 130 is the underdog. As for where the value sits in this fight, I do think that the value's on the favourite with Tony Gravely at minus 150. De Freitas did open at plus 170 though, so at that betting line, all the value was on him. But right now, I do think the value sits with Gravely now. The betting lines have closed up a little bit. As for where the betting lines move, I do think that we still see de Freitas money coming in. It feels at plus money. He's a very popular underdog, and like I say, over the last 48 to 72 hours, all that money has been coming in on de Freitas. We've hardly seen any pushback from Gravely, but I do think at some point we are going to see that brick wall on the betting line. I think if Gravely starts hitting minus 130, minus 125, we'll start seeing bets coming back in on him. Ultimately, when the fights go down on Fight Night, on Saturday night, I don't think we're going to be too far off where we're at right about now. But as for how this fight plays out, honestly, in their own sort of way, they are very similar fighters. They're both happy to strike, but they'll both be looking for takedowns. They'll both be looking to spend time topside. In regards to the striking, they're different sort of strikers. It's hard to give an edge either way here, because Gravely is a lot less volume than de Freitas, but with what Gravely actually lands and the power that he lands with is a lot more effective than what de Freitas does. So de Freitas will land more punches, but they tend to be more fundamentally sound, and they don't really cause too many problems in regards to damage. But the thing is with de Freitas, we saw in the Gutierrez fight, when he becomes desperate, he starts to rush. When he rushes, he walks forward, runs forward in fact, rock'em sock'em robot style, launching straight punches down the barrel, left, right, and he's just leaving his chin wide open to be hit. If he does that against Gravely, if Gravely gets a couple of rounds up and Freitas starts to charge at him, then it wouldn't shock me for Gravely either just to take him down or to knock him out, find an opening on that chin and put him away. But in regards to the wrestling, this is where I think that it's really key in this fight. You've got Freitas that looks to have good takedowns, you know, when he gets his fights down, single leg, double leg, or he'll grab a body lock and try and throw you down. He does have decent takedowns. When he gets on top, he's got good jiu-jitsu. He's a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt. That's where his advantages are in this fight. But going back to the wrestling, although Freitas looks good with his takedowns, there's levels to wrestling. And when you look at Gravely and look at his wrestling credentials, a 4-time All-State wrestler, 3-time All-American, 2-time state and regional champion, 4-time district champion, the dude is a serious wrestler. When it comes to the wrestling, I do think that Gravely's going to have the advantages. And people will talk about how Gravely didn't look too good against Brett Johns in regards to the wrestling, but Brett Johns is a legit fighter with good wrestling and phenomenal grappling. So for me, Brett Johns is way above where Geraldo de Freitas is at. So I don't think you can really make those comparisons in this fight. And just quickly, while we're on the topic of Tony Gravely's losses, obviously Brett Johns, Patchy Mix, Manny Bermudez, Merab Divalishvili, Ricky Bandejas. I'm really sorry if I've just butchered that surname, but the point is Gravely only loses to top fighters, and I think that De Freitas would lose also to all those fighters as well. But on the flip side with De Freitas, it's not going to be plain sailing for Tony Gravely. Gravely has got to make sure he isn't taken down in this fight or he isn't swept and reversed, which we have seen in previous fights as well. We can't ignore that. There was a reason that I bet Brett Johns against Gravely, and that was one of those reasons. I do think that if De Freitas gets on top of Gravely, that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt will play a part, but Brett Johns was also a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and I do like how Gravely was patient when he was on his back. He didn't rush, but he also didn't accept position either, and he waited for his moment to explode, shrimp out of position a little bit, get a hold of a single leg, look to stand up and re-wrestle. So I don't think that Gravely is dead in the water, so to speak, if he is taken down. It's not a good look on the scorecards, and that is a concern from Gravely's perspective. But ultimately, I do think that this fight is won and lost because of who wins those wrestling moments and who's able to spend more time on top. Now, I think De Freitas would be able to get more top control time than Gravely would be able to get on him, but the difference is I think Gravely's going to be able to dump De Freitas way more than De Freitas is going to be able to take Gravely down, and I think that's going to be the key difference in this fight. I think the striking, as I've already mentioned, is very close, very on par, even though they've got slightly different styles, so I do think it's going to come down to who's the better wrestler and who can get the fight down to the mat more often than not. For those reasons, I'm going to favour Tony Gravely. I'm picking Tony Gravely to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Moneyline. I hope you all enjoyed it, and once again guys, I'd appreciate all likes to the video and subscriptions to the MMAPlay365 YouTube channel too. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAPlay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long, short fun parlays, or ACCAs as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, and they are all at very affordable prices too. Just hop onto MMAPlay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.